So what happened with Gaza was that overnight it transformed into a place that was largely populated by Palestinian refugees. And it became a place where the majority of the population also had the memory of that trauma. Armed struggle has this therapeutic role where it makes you feel like you exist, who we are and how we experience the world. So with each rocket that's thrown, it's a reminder that the Palestinian cause lives.
So hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Book Café Podcast. I'm your host Omar Nizam, and in today's episode we will be talking about the book entitled Decolonizing Palestine, Hamas between the anti-colonial and the post-colonial. And my conversation partner for this episode is Professor Dr. Somdeep Sen, the author of the book. So hi Professor, it's really great to connect with you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so Professor, we will of course get to talking about your book in a minute, but for our viewers and listeners who haven't read the book yet and who may be discovering you as well for the very first time, do please tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Of course. I'm originally from India. Grew up in have a middle-class Bengali background, so it's great to speak to another Bengali from not too far away from where I grew up. For my bachelor's, it's interesting, I'm going all the way back to my bachelor's education, but more recently I've been talking to young students and trying to explain to them how that history from 20 some years ago shapes, who I am as an academic today. So for my bachelor's, I went to the US to study physics and economics, but that was in 2003. Now, 2003 is the year of the US invasion of Iraq. It was in the midst of the US-led war on terror. So as a brown man traveling to the US at the time to upstate New York, I had a front seat experience of the hierarchies that order international politics, questions of race, colonialism, how the global north perceives us from the global south. One of my first supervisor was John Collins, who wrote this amazing book called Global Palestine. So while I'm experiencing all of this, he introduces me to Palestine and politics of settler colonialism. All of that sort of comes through into my work, where shapes, the kind of field work that I do, the kind of methodological approaches that I take, but also my whole approach to political science as a discipline. So I'm trained as a political scientist with a PhD from the University of Copenhagen. It very much shapes these themes, these issues are very much central.
Okay. Well, Professor, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So yeah, I have to say that I really enjoyed reading your book. And as you rightly pointed out that you do have an ethnic Bengali background and you are currently based in Copenhagen. So I have to ask you this question as somebody who's based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. How good is your Bengali?
My Bengali, I would say, is pretty good. I mean, I grew up in Calcutta. I mean, I left when I was 18, and that was 20 some years ago, 21 years ago exactly. But my mother's side of the family actually comes from Bangladesh, of course, moved during partition. So they have roots in Joshua and Khulna. I had the good fortune of being the first and until now the only person from the family to visit Bangladesh since. So I have very fond memories of, there's a familiarity, cultural familiarity that I felt when I was in Bangladesh, in Dhaka. Of course, fond memories of the food, but also, looking at the current developments in Bangladesh, the kind of political activism that young students are engaging in, the pro-democracy movement, the anti-corruption movements. It's very inspirational. So yeah, it's really nice to speak on a podcast that is, based out of Dhaka.
Absolutely. Well, thank you once again for that, Professor. So as you mentioned that you have visited Dhaka and you have roots in Khulna and Joshua. So great places to visit. The current situation is still pretty much stable now after the revolution in July, August. And we do hope to have you back for another visit to see the post-revolution Bangladesh in 2024. So just coming back to the book, Professor, can you just tell us what exactly was the main thesis of the book and what inspired you to actually write a book like Decolonizing Palestine? Can you tell us about that?
So fundamentally, I'm very much concerned, or I've been very interested in trajectories of liberation struggle. Mm-hmm. How they start, what are the turns it takes along the way, when does it end, does it ever end, are we liberated? One of the things in the last chapter of the book is my conversation with my grandfather. Who, in the family, we looked up to him because as kids, because all his suits were sewn in London and flown in from London. And he read about India, but he read in English, right? And he spoke with this chaste British accent. And I remember one time, I was trying to boast to him that I can speak English. And he said to me, do you dream in English? And I was like, no, I dream in Bengali. Well, then you don't speak English, right? So these sorts of, again, this is a childhood memory that I have, but it spurred this interest on liberation, how it happens, 300 years of colonial deformation. How does that affect, who we are and how we experience the world? Mm-hmm. So, of course, the point of departure is Hamas as a Palestinian organization, specifically Hamas as post-2006. In 2006, Hamas won the Palestinian Legislative Council elections. And while as an organization, it was established as an armed faction fighting for Palestinian liberation, after the elections in 2006, it also took on governance act. And we can get into what are the circumstances of that happening. But while it took on this role as government, it also refused to give up its armed wing. Mm-hmm. And my question was that how do these two things, two ways of being that reflect, different stages of that liberation struggle, how do they live alongside each other within a colonial context, or the context of a liberation struggle? So the book, of course, starts off by looking at Hamas's armed wing. Mm-hmm. And it establishes that through interviews, and I did extensive field work in Gaza, but also in the occupied West Bank, Jerusalem, Egypt, and it establishes that the value of the armed struggle is often defined in two ways. One is its destructive ability, right? Mm-hmm. Destructive ability doesn't necessarily mean that Hamas operatives or Hamas officials believe they can actually defeat the Israeli army. But they feel that even minimally, they make the occupation of the settler colonial rule over Palestinian lands an inconvenient affair. Mm-hmm. The other aspect is what it does for them, right? Where violence has, or an armed struggle has, this therapeutic role where it makes you feel like you exist, right? So with each rocket that's thrown, it's a reminder that the Palestinian cause lives. Mm-hmm. Then was the other side, this state-building affair, right? And when I interviewed Hamas officials, I had to go buy a suit. And the gatekeeper said, well, you can't just show up looking like this in this casual manner. And I was like, well, I'm in an armed struggle. Why do I have to wear a suit? But you go and you meet these officials, they act, in a very, they act like bureaucrats. They have a suit on, they're talking about governance issues. But of course, they see governance as a way of, performing that Palestinian entity or the Palestinianness or the Palestinian peoplehood, through these governance, keeping the community together. So then I asked myself, okay, these two ways of being somehow are rationalized and make sense on the path of the liberation struggle. So what? And then I stepped back and I placed Hamas and these sorts of two ways of being. One, the armed struggle that is very much reminiscent of the anti-colonial struggle, but then the statecraft, that's something you would affect on the other side of liberation, right? When we're independent, when the colonizer has left. How do they? Okay, they both make sense, but then if you look historically, you see that the anti-colonial and the post-colonial has always lived alongside each other.
Oh, really?
I looked at, say, activism among Indian revolutionary forces, how they would organize dorm rooms in colleges in a way to reflect the future Indian state.
Right, right.
And then I also saw that, well, the anti-colonial struggle doesn't end with the flight of the colonizer. You see the struggle to be Indian, to be Bangladeshi, to be Pakistani, to be Sri Lankan, to continue long after, whether it's through language, whether it's through, defining what are the cultural artifacts that define who we are as a people, that continues long after. So then the question came to, what is the value of this moment of liberation? I don't know if you followed Bollywood movies, but in Bollywood movies about independence, you often have this scene where the Union Jack comes down and the
Indian flag
goes up, right? So this is this therapeutic moment where we become liberated. But I conclude from the book that liberation doesn't happen like that. There is no moment of liberation. It's a long, circuitous path to liberation that begins long before we are colonized, long before the colonizer has left, but long after the colonizer has taken flight.
Understood. Well, that's really interesting, Professor, because the whole thesis of the book is obviously you're looking at the post-colonial and the anti-colonial struggle, and the fact that Hamas is a kind of like an oxymoron that's in limbo between the two. But the fact that you've also found evidence of this in other freedom struggles and independence movements like India, for example, that is quite an eye-opener. So we will definitely come back to this point later on in the conversation, because I have a related question with regards to that. But let's just take a step back, Professor, and talk a little bit about the origins of Hamas. So as far as my knowledge goes, Hamas is an Arabic acronym that stands for Islamic Resistance Movement. Can you tell us a little bit more about the origins of Hamas and how exactly did they come to being and what was their raison d'etre? So do tell us about that.
So Hamas has its roots in the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's not by chance that is the Islamic resistance movement. So it was very much shaped by the Muslim Brotherhood's Islamic ethos, its charity activities, but also this idea that post-Nakba, post the establishment of the State of Israel, the decimation that came about to the Palestinian people and Palestinian community, that can only be remedied through building strong communities. So that community-based ethos was very much part of the origins of Hamas as an organization. It's important to remember that before its establishment, the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood refused to participate in the armed struggle that the PLO was participating. So said that since 1967. In fact, there are also reports that the Israeli authorities actually funded some of the activities of Islamist charities or Islamic groups in order to undermine the authority of the PLO. Now, what happened with 1987, with the start of the first Intifada, that was the moment that Hamas was established. Hamas was actually officially established in 1988, and it was the first time it went from being this community-based organization to be much more socialized into, and you saw a transition towards that, but it became formally socialized, an active part of the national struggle, and it participated, during the first Intifada, but more actively also during the second Intifada as an armed wing. So that's sort of the ideological roots of the organization. But it's also important to remember that Hamas as an organization and its early leadership is very much shaped by the trauma and the experience, the Palestinian experience that surrounded the establishment of the State of Israel. Now, when the Nakba happened, now Palestinians call it the catastrophe, With
Mm-hmm.
the establishment of the State of Israel, you saw a systematic process in which Palestinian communities was erased from the landscape, right, and created
Mm-hmm.
the Palestinian refugee crisis. And a place like Gaza became overnight after 1948. And of course, I think you've had Ilan Pape on your
We have,
podcast,
yes.
who's written groundbreaking works on that. But there's also Palestinian oral histories on the subject, right? So what happened with Gaza was that overnight it transformed into a place that was largely populated by Palestinian refugees who came from depopulated Palestinian villages.
Mm-hmm.
And it became a place where the majority of the population were refugees who were living in destitute conditions in refugee camps. But they also had the memory of that trauma.
Right.
So a lot of Hamas's early leadership were either individuals who had fled with their family, or they were children of individuals who were made refugees. So
Right.
that memory plays a very important role. Of course, the socioeconomic experience of living in refugee camps since very much shaped the activism of Gaza, right? And of course of Hamas as a place that was at the forefront of, let's say, training Palestinian refugee figures, and also at the forefront of the Palestinian struggle, the Palestinian armed struggle. It's a place that starts Intifada. It's the first Intifada started there as well. You had the Great March there as well. And we know what's happening in Gaza today.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And just staying with the first Intifada of 1987, Professor, a lot of the times we see that right after 1987, the PLO, Yasser Arafat, they were exiled in Tunisia. After it had already taken place, they quickly came back and took credit for a lot of what had happened in 1987. But as far as your research goes and all the Hamas officials that you've spoken to on the ground, would it be fair to say that this was a grassroots movement that had very little to do with the PLO and Yasser Arafat and Fatah, etc.? Or do you feel that no, they were actually pulling the strings from behind the scenes? So do tell us your take on that.
I mean, it would be, taking away the agency of, Palestinians, the grassroots. Obviously, PLO at the time was very much interested in ensuring its authority or its leadership over the Palestinian liberation struggle, right? But, obviously, the grassroots part of it was extremely important. And we see that, right? And we see the Great March of Return that we saw in Gaza. That was a grassroots movement. Of course, Hamas, being in control of Gaza, very quickly wanted to,
take credit for that. Yeah.
Take credit for the as well.
Right.
So, that's what, happens with organizations like this, and we've seen this again, this is not something particular to Palestinian organization. We've seen historically liberation fractions trying to establish their authority over the liberation struggle as as groups that determine who you fight, when you fight, and for how long, right?
Yeah, a great conversation so far. I have a zillion questions that I wish I could ask you with regards to this whole thing. We even had Andrew Gowers who wrote Arafat's biography, and this was a question I asked him as well. And so he was also of the same mind as you, that you can't take away agency from whatever the Gazans had done in 1987.
I mean, another thing that we sort of tried to, a big moment for Arafat as well, in the sense that after the first Intifada, right, they in fact, then we saw the Oslo Accords. Yeah. This was the first time. I mean, he was the terrorist, right, in terms of the global north, right? Mm-hmm. I interviewed a former bodyguard of Arafat who talked about how in Lebanon, the Israeli army was searching for Arafat door to door. Right. Now he was at the White House shaking hands with his Israeli counterpart, with Clinton in the background. Right. I mean, it's a big moment for the liberation fighter in exile to now get a seat at the table. Right. So.
Yeah, it's awesome. So coming back to the book, Professor, we all know that Israel actually pulled out of Gaza in the year 2005. They left it to the Palestinians, and they always have this saying that they had the opportunity to turn Gaza into the second Singapore. And I've been very privileged to have also visited Singapore plenty of times. It's a very impressive island nation that has gone above and beyond because of one man, Lee Kuan Yew, the prime minister, he was so visionary that he managed to change Singapore from a third world nation to a first world nation. Is this a fair critique that Gaza could have been the same? Or do you feel that no, it's because there's more to it, and that the example of Singapore is not completely analogous to that of Gaza? Do please tell us about that.
I mean, I think those that make that claim are being a bit disingenuous, to put it lightly. Mm-hmm. Israel pulled out of Gaza primarily because it was a security concern and not particularly fruitful to have a small group of settlers surrounded by Palestinians. So it was a security related decision, not a decision that was particularly concerned with Palestinian statehood or Palestinian liberation. It's important to also remember that once they pulled out, they didn't relinquish control of the Gaza Strip. They had control over all aspects of Gaza by land, air, and sea. Mm-hmm. Then I think there are a few steps that we're missing, right? 2006, you had the Palestinian Legislative Council elections, when Hamas, to the surprise of many international observers and commentators, won a free and fair elections. And between then and 2007, there was, continuous skirmishes between Hamas and Fatah before Hamas took full control of Gaza. But what came out later is that in that period, there was also a coup attempt that was funded by the United States. So David Brose has this fantastic article in Vanity Fair called "The Gaza Bombshell" that outlines or has documentation of communication between U.S. authorities and Fatah, encouraging a possible coup that would be supported by the United States. So Hamas officials say that to preempt that coup, they took over the Gaza Strip. Right. Of course, after they took over, we've seen a devastating siege, right? A siege that has, at some point, 2020, Gaza was supposed to be unlivable. We're in 2024. Mm-hmm. That's what the UN said, right? So the fact that Palestinians Gaza was simply left to their own devices and couldn't have done whatever, instead built rockets and tunnels is a bit disingenuous. The second issue is that in saying that Gaza was left alone and it could become the next Singapore, you're also ignoring the fact that Gaza is very much intertwined with what's happening in the rest of Palestine. Mm-hmm. There's this argument, both you see this in the media, in the academic discourse, but in the political discourse, where Gaza is sort of seen as something else. Yet Gaza is very much affected by what happens in Jerusalem, the settlement processes. So this is why whenever something like that happens, Gaza responds, or Hamas officials make statements regarding it, because it sees itself very much connected with the rest of Palestine, right? So even Darwish has written about it, Edward Said has written about it, that Gaza is not external to what else is happening, to the settlements, to Jerusalem. Right. Gaza is where where we see the seething core of the struggle and the seething core of the suffering, right? Mm-hmm. It's where revolution starts, it's where intifadas start, right? So to say that Gaza could just be whatever is to somehow disconnect it from the rest of Palestine and what's happening with the occupation and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, thank you for that, Professor. So I think that really hits home the point that these are two completely different examples, and of course, as you rightly said, whatever happens in the West Bank has an effect on Gaza and vice versa. So you can't really cut the umbilical cord, so they are attached at the hip. So at this point, Professor, I want to take advantage of your cultural background as a ethnic Bengali / Indian, and your vocation as a scholar of Palestine. And I actually have two questions with regards to this. The first one being that when we had the partition of India in 1947, it was not as messy as the Palestinian partition, in the sense that you had Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Lord Mountbatten coming together many times months before the actual partition to decide on what the borders would be, having roundtable discussions, different iterations, etc. So it wasn't as messy a partition, even though a lot of people died, as what we see in Palestine. What is your understanding of why we've had a reasonably better partition with India, but whereas with regards to Palestine, we see that only one group of people, the Israelis, had accepted the partition and had just ran with the gauntlet, and they left the Palestinians out to dry. So give us your thoughts on that, please.
Well, I see the roots of the question also, because in the book, yes, I talk about Palestine, but a lot of the references I make are to places as far off as Mexico and Southern Africa, India, East Africa. And yes, there are parallels and things we can learn from the variety of the pantheon of liberation struggles we've seen around the world. But I think we need to be very specific about what type of colonialism we're seeing. Mm-hmm. What Palestine has witnessed and what the state of Israel represents is settler colonialism. Mm-hmm. Now, settler colonialism is specific in the sense that it doesn't say, I think Veracini talks about this, where it doesn't say to the native, you work for us. It says you go away. Mm-hmm. In the sense that settler colonialism is premised on the notion that the land that the settler is, building the new state on, or the settler state on, is empty land. Mm-hmm. That is devoid of people. Israel is the same. It's a land. It was built for people without land, on a land without a people.
Without a people, right.
This doesn't mean that early Zionist activists and pioneers didn't know that there were people there. They knew, except they didn't recognize them as a real people, with a real peoplehood, with a real identity, with a real, and relatedly, a real claim to the land. Which is why, as you point out, they were able to they completely ignored the legitimate concerns and aspirations of the Palestinian people, because Palestine doesn't exist, right? And so I think that's where, this is a very specific context, but it also tells you the severity of it. Because again, if you call Israel a settler colonial state, then you'll have to start looking at Australia. You have to look at New Zealand. You have to look in North America and see what happened to the Aboriginal people or the first peoples in these places.
Absolutely. And I definitely take your point, Professor, because at the end of the day, India was partitioned between two groups of indigenous peoples with different, religious backgrounds. But in Palestine, you have settlers and, the people who are indigenous to the land. So, yeah, I suppose the two examples aren't exactly analogous, but that is definitely something that always, came to mind whenever we thought of partition. So the second question, Professor, related to, India/Palestine. As you know that, Dr. Shashi Tharoor has, written many books on, the British Empire and its hold on India for 200 years. And one of the things that he's always talked about is the fact that the Indian civil service, or the imperial civil service, was such that anybody who joined it actually paid for their own occupation, because the British couldn't actually control India with the small tiny population that they had. They had to have Indians employed in order to prolong the empire. In the same vein, would you say that the Palestinian Authority is actually playing the exact same role that the Indian civil service or the imperial civil service did in pre-partition India?
Absolutely. We know very well that Palestinian Authority has a security coordination agreement with Israeli authorities, where they work actively to undermine any Palestinian activism. We've seen this over and over again in the occupied West Bank, where activists will be prevented who want to go and protest in front of a settlement, will be prevented from reaching the settlement before the Israeli army comes in. It'll be the Palestinian Palestinian Authority.
Wow.
So the Palestinian Authority is very much playing that role. Obviously, when you talk to, so I've written another book about the Palestinian Authority, they keep bringing up, their, Palestinian Authority officials, they'll bring up their credentials, their liberation struggle credentials. They'll say, well, we fought, during the first Intifada but they will insist that since then, we're in a different phase. That time was a time of fighting, now it's a time of governing. Of course, that's a disingenuous argument, considering the settlement movement that is, continues unabated, and considering what has been happening in Gaza, not just since October 7th, but also the longer history of the siege. So, yeah, absolutely. I think most commentators, and we've seen even activism among young Palestinians who are not from that Oslo generation, right? Who don't feel a certain sense of ownership of that process, which was historic, granted, right? Who don't feel ownership of that, are protesting the Palestinian Authority. Right. In fact, one of the interviews, or some of the interviews that I've done in the West Bank, they talk about these intelligence sharing and this revolving door of arrests, where you'll be first arrested by the Palestinian Authority, then by the Israelis, then by the Palestinian Authority, and there's intelligence sharing between those two parties.
Wow. So in other words, collaborating to ensure that the occupation is perpetual. That's quite astonishing. And, I do thank you for mentioning this, Professor, because, coming from a scholar, it just hits home the point that, the PA is not a good, they don't have the best interests of the Palestinian people at heart. And that definitely is a huge eye opener. So I want to talk about something else, Professor, just winding back to 1988, when Hamas had come up with their charter. There's that infamous slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Do you find this to be an anti-Semitic slogan at all? Or do you feel that it is just trying to tell us, give us the aspirations of the people who've been under occupation for what was 40 years up to that point? So do tell us your take on that.
Well, I think that the slogan in its origins, of course, it's been painted as an anti-Semitic slogan that is against the existence of the Jewish people, right? But in fact, I would claim that slogan actually covers the extent of what has happened to the Palestinian people since the establishment of the State of Israel. When it comes to Palestinians who, Palestinian citizens of Israel, but also the occupied territories. So, liberation is not just about liberating the West Bank or East Jerusalem or Gaza. It's about also liberating Palestinians from a settler colonial regime.
Right.
That covers territories where, Palestinian citizens of Israel also live.
Absolutely. And in your previous answer, Professor, you mentioned October 7th. So we're actually coming up to the 1-year anniversary of the events of October 7th. And even though this is outside the purview of your book, I have to ask you, was this something that caught you by surprise as well, as to the scale and the extent of, an operation that Hamas had carried out? Yeah.
I think the scale of the operation and the impact of the operation was surprising. Also, the fact that the extent to which the Hamas operatives were able to enter Israel, right? This is not surprising. This has happened before, where Hamas operatives has used tunnels to attack an outpost and then run back. That has happened before, but this manner in which that has happened was surprising. But the fact that there was something was going to give, so to speak, wasn't necessarily surprising to me, because, again, if you see just that year, there was a massive uptick in settler violence. Again, this is how Gaza is connected to the rest of Palestine. We've seen an uptick in settler violence. Even the days before, there were attacks on Gaza, and the siege was coming to, it had been a 16, 17-year siege, right? Mm-hmm. That means that there's been a severe socioeconomic stress on the Gaza Strip, massive level of malnutrition, energy crisis, water crisis, health crisis, also what we saw during the pandemic. But it also meant that an organization like Hamas was having a hard time finding its feet. If you again remember, Hamas came to power as a resistance organization that was going to govern and protect the resistance. Yet governance doesn't really make sense in a territory that was under siege by land, air, and sea. So oftentimes, when I interviewed, Palestinians in Gaza, they'd say, Hamas is rubbish at governing. They don't know what to do. So it's better that they just fight. So oftentimes resistance, in order to show their resistance credentials, they would engage in some back and forth with Israel. So in some way, this was part of that, attempt to reassert its identity as a resistance organization. But of course, that doesn't take away from the fact that there were a multiplicity of other factors that led to it, right?
Absolutely. And it's stated that about 1,200 Israelis had died during October 7th, and some of them may have been even killed by the IDF, through the crossfire or inadvertently, etc. And the response of the Israelis after that, Professor, it has been extremely devastating for Gaza. Would you say that the intent behind it was to ensure that Gaza is unlivable, or the fact that are they really trying to get rid of Hamas, or do they actually believe in their heart of hearts that is something that is a unforeseeable goal or unattainable goal, and that the only reason the war is continuing is because of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's personal stake in ensuring that he is not taken off to jail on corruption charges?
I mean, that we have to recognize that that's a big part of it, right? Netanyahu's personal political situation, motivations, right? I mean, he assassinated the Hamas leader in the middle of negotiations. Right. Just yesterday, during an interview on CNN, Lebanese politician was mentioning how the day before Nasrallah was assassinated, he had agreed to a ceasefire agreement along with the US and France, right? So there is something there. There are certain political stakes there for Netanyahu. But we also need to remember of the historically antagonistic relationship that Israel has vis-a-vis Gaza. I wrote an article a couple of years ago for Foreign Policy titled, "Why Does Israel Hate Gaza?" And that has to do with that fact, what I talked about earlier, of this long history of Gaza as being a place where Palestinian revolutionary figures, Palestinian fighters, Palestinian armed figurations are trained and where they're rooted, right? This Palestinian revolutionary fervor. That has meant that even though the Nakba and the establishment of the state of Israel is premised on this idea that this was empty land, it's being difficult to materialize that because Gaza continues to live. So whatever happens, whether it's Hamas or with the rockets or the Intifadas, Gaza continuously reminds us that it was an empty territory, which is why historically, Israeli authorities have had an extreme level of contempt for Gaza. They've talked about, before this, they've talked about, mowing the lawn, pushing Gaza into the sea. During the first Intifada, there was a policy of breaking bones of young, activists or grassroots activists in Gaza. So, of course, there was the attack of October 7th was immensely surprising and traumatic. But that has also, I think, spurred this feeling that we need to clear it out once and for all. It isn't about Hamas, obviously, considering the way in which Gaza has been leveled from schools to empty university buildings. I think that the attempt is to basically ensure that there is no way of maintaining any sort of Palestinian life in Gaza, right? And the idea is that they should just go away. And of course, the
Yeah.
settlement movements and settlement activists and real estate companies already, working 24/7 to advertise buildings on the coast of Gaza and so on and so forth. Right? So.
Fascinating. Well, at this point, Professor, I have a surprise guest question for you. It's from a guest we've had on the show already. And her name is Professor Dr. Rebecca Ruth Gould. She's a professor at SOAS, University of London, and she's the author of the book Erasing Palestine. So with your permission, I'm just going to read you her question. And so Professor Gould's question is, do you think Hamas has the potential to become an effective governing authority in Gaza after the end of this genocide? What will be their relationship with other Palestinian groups and parties, such as Fatah and Islamic Jihad? And might a coalition of sorts eventually emerge? So yeah, the question from Professor Ruth Gould. Yeah.
I mean, it's difficult to say whether it can, difficult to think through what would be the material basis of that governance, right? In the sense that there is nothing left in Gaza, right? So Hamas, what I can say is that historically, Hamas has, make indications towards building a coalition government with other factions. During my time in Gaza, during fieldwork, it has demonstrated that it is able to effectively govern despite being under siege. So they take a lot of pride in that sort of role. So for instance, when I would interview Hamas officials, they talk about, well, when Israel is attacking, we make sure that one of our workers goes around and gives the public servants their checks, their salary, pays their salary, right? Mm-hmm. So there is this, urge to govern. They have the willingness, and they are to a certain extent able to do that, which of course comes out in very bizarre ways. For instance, before you leave Gaza, you have to register with sort of border authorities. That the Gaza border authorities have no control. It's the Egyptians who are running. Right. But you have this bizarre moment where you show up and they ask you, okay, so when are you leaving? All right. So did you come in by road or by tunnel? Right, again, the bizarre question that is, but nonetheless, they are equipped to do that, right? Mm-hmm. They have worked towards trying to build some shell of governance, right? I think it's possible. I think even a coalition, considering the trauma of what we've seen in Gaza, and of course, we shouldn't forget with regards to what's happening in the West Bank, I think there is because of that trauma, these organizations wouldn't have much legitimacy among the Palestinian populace if they continue their infighting. Mm-hmm. So I think there could be a push to build a coalition authority. My only concern is on what material basis, because it seems like Israeli authorities have decimated all of that, the materiality of what could be possible.
Right, absolutely. And just winding back to 2013, Professor, during your visit to Gaza, can you help us understand did Hamas actually enjoy a lot of popularity back in 2013 vis-a-vis 2024, vis-a-vis 2006 when they actually won the election? And as we all know that they haven't had an election in almost 18 years. Do they still retain the same level of popularity, or has it changed, do you feel?
I mean, it's changed massively. So in 2006, I think it's important, it was of course immensely popular, and it was primarily also because it received its electoral mandate, because there was this perception of the Palestinian Authority led by Fatah had completely undermined the Palestinian liberation struggle. In fact, it had actively worked with Israeli authorities to undermine it. Mm-hmm. So Hamas got this electoral mandate to rise to the helm of the Palestinian Authority, but would take the liberation struggle with it. So use the tools of governance to also perpetuate and protect the liberation struggle, or as Hamas officials would say, protect the liberation. They had, during interviews, they would say, well, the previous government attacked the liberation struggle, attacked the resistance, we protected. Mm-hmm. Of course, that popularity has dipped, I would say significantly, until the day before October 7th, primarily because as a governing entity, especially during the siege, it had become, in order to maintain its authority over all aspects of political life and social life in Gaza, in many ways, they had become a very authoritarian entity. Mm-hmm. To the extent, it created these tragic scenarios. And one of the people that I interviewed, when he was young, he was shot by the Israeli army. So he had this scar all over his body from the operation that he had. But when I was there, he was also beaten up by Hamas people, right? So it creates a huge psychological impact, right? So these sorts of authoritarian actions, these authoritarian means of operating, these means of repressive ways of maintaining authority had disenfranchised a lot of Palestinians in Gaza. So you would often hear, sometimes you'd hear people saying that, well, they're horrible at governance, so they should justify it. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people would, take a more softer approach where they'll say, well, what are they meant to do in such a scenario where we're under this devastating siege, right? So I forget the numbers at this point. So, but I think there were numbers going around that before October 7th, their popularity was at 20% or something. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, there's always this level of flux, but it definitely wasn't as popular in Gaza as it was in 2006. Right?
Understood. Right. So if there were to be an election, hypothetically, would you feel that Hamas would be able to hold on to power by getting votes, or do you feel that 20% will come back to haunt them? So
it's hard to say, right? I expect that if there's an election, it would end up being, somewhat of a coalition government that they would have to come into. Mm-hmm. I think, especially in the Gaza Strip, it's interesting to see the fluctuations in popularity, where there are moments where Hamas has been more popular in the West Bank than in the Gaza Strip, right? Mm-hmm. I would expect them to, talk about their resistance credentials, but then have to engage in some sort of coalition. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how an organization like Fatah would fare. They're extremely unpopular and delegitimized for their inaction, but also their complicity in all these years.
Right, understood. So let's zoom out a little bit, Professor, and I want you to look into your crystal ball and tell us, in the next decade or so, maybe next 2-3 decades, do you foresee that, given that we've got 7 million Jews and 7 million Arabs between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, are we actually going to see a two-state solution, or are we going to see one democratic state, one person, one vote?
Crystal ball. Yes, it's hard to conjecture about or think about the future when the present is so tragic, right? What Palestinians are facing right now is essentially complete erasure. We talk a lot about Gaza, but we should not forget what's happening in the West Bank, where, as it has been throughout 2023, the settlement movement is on top gear, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. So the territorial basis, the material basis for a two-state solution is disappearing and decimating, right? And that's the whole point of the settlement movement, right? In fact, in 2016, 2017, I did some field work in Israeli settlement for my next book. And, settlers would joke, let's have a two-state solution. Let's see what you have left for a two-state solution. Right? So obviously Palestinians, but also the Lebanese people are seeing or are the ones who are most tragically and devastatingly impacted by what's happening. But it's also revealing in some ways the unsustainable nature of the occupation, the way in which this politics of erasure has been pursued by the State of Israel. It also is in many ways demonstrating that the State of Israel cannot go back to business as usual after this. It'll not be able to, right? And when that happens, and with the way the settlement movement has happened, the way the material erasure of Palestinian existence has happened, we may have to think about a one-state solution, the democratic state with, a multi-ethnic democratic state with one vote, one person. But as we see, in a place like South Africa, it's a long road to reconciliation. Right?
Absolutely.
The traumas are quite fresh. The memories are fresh. So there's a lot of trust building that would need to happen. Of course, again, it's very difficult to think about that future when we are seeing what we're seeing. Right?
Yeah.
We've seen a complete breakdown of liberal global order and all, value-based systems, laws, human rights. I can say that I'm someone who's worked on this region for last decade and a half. But I never imagined that it would reach this stage, right? Also with Gaza and also the region implications. So again, yes, crystal ball, but it's very difficult to look beyond what's happening today.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Professor, for those thoughts. So we're pretty much coming to the end of our episode, Professor, but just before we let you go, as you know that our show is called Book Café Podcast, so the word book is in the title. So we have a couple of staple questions that we love to ask all of our guests, specifically with regards to books. So with your permission, let me just ask you two of them. So the first staple question is, are you more of a fiction person or a nonfiction person? What genre of books do you enjoy reading?
Nonfiction. For sure. I think also because of the kind of work that I do, nonfiction, but also I've been very much, rooted in looking at historical texts about land, liberation, colonialism, history, and nonfiction books is my preference.
Okay, wonderful. So the second staple question, and I'm told by a lot of our guests that it's a really tough question, but given that you're such an avid reader and you have a really impressive library of books behind you, I'm sure you can give us a very good answer. And the question is, if you could select a book that you feel that every, let's say, young person should read at least once in their lifetime. It may be a fiction book, it may be a non-fiction book, or it could be a combination of both. But if you could pick a book that is both edifying and useful, what would be your pick?
I would say Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks.
Okay.
And specifically for young people from our parts of the world, from the colonized and formerly colonized world, I think for us to venture out in the world and figure out who we are and are placed in a world that is still very much dominated by the white North. And with our histories and legacies of how, our minds have been colonized as well through, centuries of colonial deformation, I think Frantz Fanon's works have been, academically useful, but immensely therapeutic for me. So,
on that note, let me just conclude by saying that for our viewers and listeners who have been with us all this time, thank you very much for staying till the end. If you are watching this on YouTube, please be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon to get the notifications. The book, once again, is Decolonizing Palestine, Hamas Between the Anti-Colonial and the Postcolonial by Professor Dr. Somdeep Sen. Professor, my thanks to you as well. You've been a wonderful guest. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I really hope to have you back for a future discussion whenever your next book comes out or whenever I get a chance to read your other books. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.